Okay, let's talk about the specific anatomy of the kidneys. Now, I'm going to kind of have to do this in two different stages because the internal anatomy of the kidneys is really complicated and it involves a lot of tiny tubes sort of overlaid on top of each other. I'm going to divide it up into the blood flow through the kidney and then the flow of the urinary tubules. This is complex. I'll see if I can find some images to add to this a little bit as I go to make it a little more clear if I can. So let's start by looking at the blood flow to the kidneys. So we sketch up a kidney here. Now, first thing to know about the kidney is that it is roughly divided into these two layers. There's an outer cortex and an inner medulla. So this is the cortex, this is the medulla. That difference is going to be cleared in the anatomy and in how they work. So incoming blood on the renal artery that incoming blood starts to split up into smaller arteries as I'm coming in here. There actually is a distinct pattern, but this is not it. This is not anatomically accurate. So we're splitting up into smaller renal arteries, which then split into even smaller ones. I do not need you to know the names of these particular blood vessels. If you've taken anatomy, you know a little bit more about it. That's not important here. But these smaller arteries move along the border between the cortex and the medulla. And then from those, even smaller arteries head up into the cortex. So what we've done here is blood comes in, splits up into multiple arteries, which then go across the top of the medulla, bottom of the cortex. From those, tiny arteries head outward into the cortex. And from those arteries, we split off lots of little arterioles. I'm not going to draw them all in here, I'm just sort of sketch. These tiny ones are the first one, other than the renal artery, the first one whose name I want you to know. These are called afferent arterioles. These are these little ones coming off of the arteries that head upward into the cortex. Each of these afferent arterioles is going to lead to one particular filtration machine in the kidney. So each of these to one particular filtration machine, which is known as a nephron. Nephron. That's not good handwriting. The nephron is the name for the individual filtration machine, each filtration unit in the kidney. So we're going to spend a fair amount of time on how nephrons are arranged. But right now, our blood has now gone out and up in the cortex. It gets into the filtration machines. That's where the filtration, 20% of the blood leaving the 20% of the plasma leaving the blood, entering the urinary tubule, reabsorption, secretion goes on. After all of that, almost all of that blood is going to come back. And it comes back along sort of a parallel pathway. We have tiny veins that head down out of the cortex alongside the little ones that went into the cortex. Those veins feed into veins that come alongside the ones that arch across those are now coming together into larger veins. That then leave the kidney on as the renal veins. So, blood comes in, splits up, goes up to the cortex, gets filtered. What's left, the blood we're keeping, comes back and leaves the kidney that way. Very complex internal blood flow here, but it follows that pattern. Go out to the cortex, split off into the filtration units, and then the stuff you're keeping come back from the filtration units and leave the kidney. So the next step is the filtration units. That's going to require another diagram here. So I'm going to try to sketch as best I can the same kidney here. Sort of. So you could almost imagine kind of trying to overlay these one on top of the other to get a sense of how this works. Now, starting out here in the cortex, we've got all of the little filtration machines, the nephrons. Those consist of the urinary tubules. Now, I can't possibly draw them all in because there's approximately 1 million of these in each kidney. So I'm going to draw in a few examples. So here's one. So there's one urinary tubule right there. This tangled up collection of tubes that feeds onto a tube that comes straight down out of the cortex and into the medulla. These tubes that are coming down, these are called collecting ducts. These come together in groups called pyramids. That pyramid is sort of a cone-shaped group of collecting ducts. That one would lie right here. This pyramid would be here. There'd be another one here. So you'll notice they sort of lie in between the areas where these blood vessels are. These blood vessels are traveling up in areas called the renal columns. The pyramids lie between the renal columns. So that's just one urinary tubule. Imagine hundreds of thousands of those in here. Some of them are like this, starting fairly high up in the cortex. Some of them, though, are lower down. And go deeper into the medulla. Those are just two different kinds of nephrons, and we're going to talk more about those later. I just wanted to sketch them on here for you. So if I just sort of sketch in a few more of these renal pyramids. These renal pyramids gather into a structure called the renal pelvis. This renal pelvis is where these collecting ducts all drain into. So, each of these filtration units does the job of filtering out the stuff that we want to get rid of. That's collecting in this urinary tubule, shown here in black. The urinary tubules then feed into the collecting ducts, which drain that stuff which is on its way to becoming urine, down the pyramids into the renal pelvis. In the renal pelvis, that urine collects and then leaves the kidney on the ureter. So, just to say it again, blood comes in, splits up, heads out to the cortex. In the cortex, we go, and to some degree the medulla, we'll get to that. We go through the process of filtration, reabsorption, secretion, splitting it up into stuff we're going to keep, which then comes back out and leaves on the renal veins, and stuff we're going to get rid of, which after we're done processing it through the urinary tubule, drains down the collecting ducts to the renal pelvis, and from the pelvis down the ureter toward the bladder. So that's the sort of overall anatomy of the kidney. Our next job, one other thing. This renal pelvis is generally where kidney stones form. So if the stone condenses out of the filtrate in here, by this point we could call it urine, it can get stuck either sometimes here right at the beginning of the ureter or further down along. Anyway. So what we're going to focus on now is the details of this thing, because what I drew is this tangled up little group of urinary tubule here, but it's actually much more than that. We also have lots of capillaries from the blood supply in here, and the interaction between the capillaries and the urinary tubule here along this loop and even down here in the medulla is what's going to do the complicated job of filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. It's really, really cool. The arrangement of tubules in here allows us to do this amazing process of sorting out blood into stuff we want to keep and stuff we want to throw out. But it is a little bit complicated. So we're going to spend most of the next 2 lectures on that. But in the last part of this lecture, I'm going to get into the detailed anatomy of one of these things, which we call nephrons. So that's what's coming next.